Joining us now is Washington DC correspondent at UnHerd, Emily Jashinsky. Emily, thank you for joining us. I want to start off with DOGE. It's been announced that it has recovered nearly $2 billion in funds that were misplaced by the Biden administration. Now, it belonged to the Department of Housing and Urban Development and was discovered a day after DOGE launched a task force at the agency. Now, Elon Musk says that it's astounding how much taxpayer money can be saved with just a small amount of effort. Now, we know that Elon Musk has been posting so much to the point he's now tripping up and making some mistakes, and that is a concern. But $2 billion, he's right that is absolutely astounding.
Yeah, people in the rest of the country outside of DC take that really seriously. It feels like a more just use of their taxpayer dollars. And that's why poll after poll is putting Donald Trump's approval rating very high. People so far are pretty pleased with what DOGE is doing, with how Donald Trump has allowed DOGE to operate. It's extraordinarily unpopular here in Washington, DC, I'll tell you that much, where everybody's livelihoods are tied to the federal government in one way or another for the most part. But I think that's why in the rest of the country, especially the way the media is reacting to DOGE, people are starting to tune out the media panic. They look at these numbers and they say, listen, this is a drop in the bucket to our national debt. $2 billion honestly is nothing. Even if you add up all of those $2 billion that Elon Musk is almost certainly going to find, sometimes it's going to be more than $2 billion. He's going to go into the Pentagon. We know that in the coming days. So even if you add up all that money, it still doesn't put a dent in the debt and the deficit here in the United States. But, and this is what's so crucial, it does mean a lot to people whose taxpayer money is a real sacrifice to them every year, and they see people abusing it. That actually matters, and the media is forgetting it.
Absolutely. And Elon Musk continues to post updates. The most recent update, or one of them, is that millions in the Social Security database, millions of people who are listed there, are apparently between the ages of 100 and 160. He posted a chart that shows that 20 million are listed with the age of 100 or higher. He claims there's even one person in the database with the age of more than 360, and they're marked as alive. You know, this is not just a handful, but millions. It makes you wonder how long this would continue to go on for if DOGE didn't exist.
It's terrifying, and why you see some people on the left now reacting in a way that is like, we should have done this. You're seeing that kind of from some Obama circles now. They're looking at what Musk is doing, and I've seen competing reports on the veracity of that particular claim that he posted, as you mentioned earlier. And he said this himself. He said, not everything I post is going to be right. He just kind of sort of shoot from the hip. But what we've seen in the recent weeks is how outdated our record keeping is in the United States. That's actually why the department that DOGE took over, it's called the USDS, Digital Services, that's why it exists. What has it been doing for all of the years since Obamacare, when the online launch of that failed, the department was created? Why is it taking DOGE all of these years later, 10 plus years later, to look into some of this stuff and realize that we still have bureaucrats taking bikes through warehouses in the mountains of Pennsylvania to get really basic records? I think this is why this news, when the American people see it, it doesn't bother them that it's disruptive, because they see a system that needs to be disrupted.
Absolutely. And he's doing it so quickly. In just 48 hours, DOGE slashed a whopping $370 million in taxpayer dollars being spent on DEI at the Department of Education. You know, why DEI just seems to be such a big theme of where they're seeing so much money being spent or being wasted. But Emily, I also want to ask you about what's going on in the courts. A federal judge appears to be quite skeptical of the state's request to bar Elon Musk and Trump's administration from accessing federal data and firing federal workers. Attorney generals from 14 states argue that Musk and Trump's administration have engaged in illegal executive overreach. But Judge Tanya Chutkan essentially says that she's not convinced that there's any evidence of harm. How do you see this playing out?
Yeah, so this is really interesting because these DOGE employees are actually now employees of the federal government. They are not like Elon Musk. They are not special government employees. He has a very specific designation, and he has to be careful not to run afoul of that, because that could be something that does really upset the American people. If it looks like this big tech CEO is coming in and, you know, arranging deals for himself while he's going through all these agencies, that's absolutely a real concern. These DOGE guys, though, they keep getting called like the DOGE kids or the DOGE bros. They're actual employees employees of the federal government. They have gotten security clearances. And so I think that's where you see Tanya Chutkan coming in and saying, anyone can hire guys like this. It's just people aren't used to them doing it the way that they're doing it. It's not used to them coming without any bureaucratic background, being so young. But that's different from it being illegal, of course. Some of what the Trump administration has done is intentionally designed to push court battles. So like the birthright citizenship change that he made on day one, they want that. The administration wants that to go into the courts and be decided by the courts. They're not naive. They don't, have any ideas that it's not going to get challenged in court. They want it to be decided by the court. They do want executive power to be something that goes into the court. They want the ball to be in the court's court so that the court can say this is an appropriate use of executive power or this has to go back to Congress. A lot of this is intentionally by design, though.
There are also reports that the IRS will lay off as many as 15,000 employees as the White House continues to slash spending across the government, but it's not clear how widespread IRS layoffs will affect the tax season, which officials expect to see more than 140 million returns. What's the reaction been to this development so far?
Yeah, so this is one of the other areas where Elon Musk is going to have to be careful because the American people are pleased to see IRS agents getting laid off if they're outside of Washington, D.C. for the most part. But something that the left has claimed for a long time is that when you cut IRS agents, they end up not focusing on the highest tax or the highest income individuals. So someone like Elon Musk doesn't get as much oversight. It ends up going to the middle class or even to the lower class because it's just easier to extract money from them. Whereas with high income earners, you get litigated, someone like Elon Musk himself. So I think they have to be careful in making these cuts to also execute a plan so it doesn't look like big tech CEOs are getting favorable treatment. That's going to be difficult, but this is not something that is controversial outside of Washington, D.C., the idea of slashing the IRS staff.
Let's talk about JD Vance. He used his speech at the Munich Security Conference accusing European governments of retreating from their values and ignoring voters' concerns when it comes to migration and free speech. Let's take a listen.
And of all the pressing challenges that the nations represented here face, I believe there is nothing more urgent than mass migration. The number of immigrants who entered the EU from non-EU countries doubled between 2021 and 2022 alone, and of course it's gotten much higher since. And we know the situation, it didn't materialize in a vacuum. It's the result of a series of conscious decisions made by politicians all over the continent and others across the world over the span of a decade.
The mainstream media went into meltdown over this. Here's the BBC's headline: JD Vance attacks Europe over free speech and migration. But Emily, it's argued that his comments are absolutely justified. Mass migration is a huge problem facing Europe. And as for free speech, that has to be defended.
It's amazing. I mean, even some people on the American left looked at JD Vance's speech and said, I'm thinking of Glenn Greenwald. Like, it is remarkable to hear an American leader speaking this way. And I would add to that, it's remarkable to see someone on the right who is as high profile in American politics as JD Vance is speaking this way at a conference like this from a podium like that one. These are things that have been unspoken for a long time. And JD Vance very eloquently made an argument about in front of people who never hear this type of criticism. They relegate this type of criticism to the fringes of disinformation and conspiracy theorizing. And that's even how his speech was covered, which is the most predictable thing in the world. Some of these obvious facts that he's sharing got written off and smeared by the mainstream media as conspiracy mongering or fringe thought. And so they just basically proved his point. And what they're also proving is how hard it's going to be for the Trump administration to make this argument, for it to fall and with any welcomeness among other world leaders. But I mean, these are hard truths that go unspoken very often.
Absolutely. And thank goodness we do have platforms such as X where we can see the speech in full. People aren't no longer really listening to or relying on the mainstream media for their take on what's been happening. Let's talk about the talks between the US and Russia about the war in Ukraine that are reportedly set to begin tomorrow. The Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, Middle East Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, and National Security Advisor Mike Waltz are travelling to Saudi Arabia for the talks. Now, Saudi Arabia xenophobia is expected to be involved, playing a mediation role. And it comes after the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer said that he was willing to put British troops on the ground in Ukraine to enforce a peace deal if that's necessary. And this is what Donald Trump has had to say on the war.
No, I think he wants to stop. That was my question to him. Because if he's going to go on, that would have been a big problem for us. And that would have caused me a big problem because you just can't let that happen. I think he wants to end it, and they want to end it fast. Both of them. And Zelensky wants to end it too.
Emily, it's going to be really interesting. What are you expecting from these talks? I suppose, how quickly could we even see some sort of agreement being made?
Yeah, I mean, Donald Trump, of course, said he could do this very, very quickly before he was elected president, and we'll test that. He does. The way that he's talking right there, I think, is clearly trying to show his leverage. And the question is whether, we've already seen some people in the ultra pro-Ukrainian position who believe that Ukraine should not have to give up an inch of its territory, accuse the Trump administration of pushing Ukraine out of these talks. Marco Rubio actually responded to that and said, well, we're obviously talking to them. We've been talking to them. So I think that's going to be a theme coming out of this, is whether it looks like Ukraine had appropriate input and had an appropriate, I guess, seat at the table. If it was, that seems to be Zelensky's sensitivity point. And Marco Rubio is going to have to make that case. Donald Trump's going to have to make that case, frankly. But I'm sure that they have very specific plans, because Keith Kellogg, his NSA, or his former NSA, Trump's former NSA, who's now his special envoy here, has talked about this in detail for months before Donald Trump was even elected. So they have a lot to talk about, that is for sure.
Absolutely. We'll be watching it very closely. I want to talk to you about the Democrats. Early polling shows who the front runners might be 3 years out from the 2028 Democratic presidential primary. Newsweek reports that the prominent Democrats taking an early lead include, wait for it, Kamala Harris, Gavin Newsom, AOC, and even Tim Walz's name is emerging. My goodness, they really are in a weak position. Look, do you have any faith, just listening to who's listed as some of the key players who are the top options for the Democrats? Are any of those going to work, or do they need someone else to come through?
This is absolutely crazy. This is a disaster for Democrats. They've got nothing right now if these are their best options. I think probably Gavin Newsom is the strongest of those, just because he understands how to adapt to this very, very rapidly changing political climate. But of that list, I mean, can any one of them pass the Joe Rogan test? And by that, I mean, could any one of them sit for a conversation with Joe Rogan and come across as relatable and appealing? Kamala Harris obviously didn't even try, but had she tried, I'm not so sure. It may have helped her a little bit, but it actually may have backfired, because you have to be somebody. J.D. Vance did this very well. Obviously Trump did it well in terms of authenticity and being an entertainer, but J.D. Vance sat and talked to Joe Rogan authentically, guy to guy, for a long time. Could any of those people on that list pass that test? Are any of them actually able to reach out to your average working class, white or black or Hispanic male voter to the point where Democrats are able to put up better numbers in a presidential election? No, is a very clear answer to that question at this point. So that's a really, really sharp problem for them.
Absolutely not. That is the short answer. No, but it's great to see the Joe Rogan test, that's kind of the new standard, that politicians can't get away with just one or two catchphrases or some spin. They really have to be authentic and be able to speak for 3 hours, answering all types of questions and not getting tripped up. I think it's a good thing, and I think it means that, Americans can get a stronger sense of who someone really is. Kamala Harris, she attended a Broadway show in New York City, and she reminded everyone about her speaking skills. Let's take a listen.
For those rights to be maintained, which means we have to be vigilant, and it's just the nature of it. Look at this beautiful play and everything that we know he had to suppress so much. But he knew, and he took those risks. But we have to be clear-eyed. And it doesn't mean we don't see the beauty in everything, right? These things all coexist. But I believe we fight for something, not against something.
Another word salad, that's what she's known for, and that's not changing. I really doubt that there are that many people who are watching a clip like that and going, oh, she's presidential, or, wish she was in charge.
I mean, what a perfect segue from the last conversation we were having about Joe Rogan, in that Kamala Harris could have sat for 3 hours all she wanted, but she still sounds like this. And that's the big problem with Democratic politicians right now, is that Donald Trump forced Republicans to put up candidates that just relate better to the American people because maybe they're more casual, maybe they're more adapted to digital media. But Democrats haven't had anything forcing them to do that. They had Joe Biden, a man who couldn't take questions for most of his presidency at length because he would stare off into the distance and look like he was lacking mental capacity. So they haven't been forced, right? Yes, that was very clear to everyone, and they haven't been forced to put up someone who really can be authentic. And this is Kamala Harris in what should be the most authentic situation in the world. She's just talking to some people. It's not even a speech. She's just talking. And she can't do that without sounding like a robot. And that's true of most high-profile Democrats because they haven't had something like Donald Trump force them to choose better people at this point.
Finally, Vivek Ramaswamy appears to have kicked off his campaign to become Ohio's next governor. He's filed paperwork with the Ohio Secretary of State's office, signalling his run for the 2026 election. Now, he's expected to launch his campaign next week. What can we expect from this, Emily?
This is actually going to be a really tough race. He comes in with a lot of name recognition and probably a lot of money. He has baked into his candidacy that he's been close to Donald Trump. That said, these races do tend to be more local. And what that means is the Republican Party in Ohio and Republican voters in Ohio are going to look at this race really closely. It's not going to all be about name recognition, and it's not going to all be about money. So if you're someone who came up through the ranks in Ohio politics over the course of years, you actually will, as Ramaswamy's likely opponents have, you're actually going to have to deal with that if you're Ramaswamy. So I think a lot of people saw this as maybe a consolation prize, a slam dunk, like, oh, he's going to run back to Ohio and he'll climb the ladder there and it'll be a sort of easy rung on the ladder for him. But actually, these things are really tough. J.D. Vance's primary was really tough in the Senate race back when he was first elected by Republicans. So this is not going to be a slam dunk by any stretch of the imagination, though he will certainly be competitive.
Washington DC correspondent at UnHerd, Emily Jashinsky, thank you so much for joining us on Power Hour.
Thanks for having me.